Some heroes are honored with medals. Others are left to guard the gates they once fought to defend. At Fort Arden, an aging black man in a faded jacket held the post at the south gate. Most passed him without a glance. Some laughed. "He acts like he's still in the army," they'd whisper. But that morning, everything changed. A 4-star general halted his convoy, stepped out, and gave the man a formal salute, one that stunned the entire base into silence. Who was this nobody in the security vest? Why did the most powerful man on post salute him like a decorated war hero? And what had the army tried to erase? If you've ever judged someone by their job title or been judged for yours, this story may leave you thinking twice. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories of hidden valor move you, subscribe, like, and pass this along. Someone you know may need to hear it. The morning light washed over Fort Arden in clean lines, sun slicing through pine trees, wind catching the flags as they climbed silver poles. Reveille had long passed, but the base still stirred with duty. Boots crunching gravel, voices on radios, a distant cadence echoing from the motor pool. At the south gate, Elijah Brooks stood still. Not stiff, not slouched, just present. He nodded politely as cars rolled through, his clipboard steady, his eyes tracking details others missed. Some soldiers waved, some ignored him, a few smirked. His vest read contracted security, but to Elijah it didn't matter what the patch said. Routine grounded him. It reminded him that he still had a role, even if it looked nothing like the one he'd once held. Elijah sat alone at the metal picnic table, just outside the commissary, the morning breeze tugging gently at his sleeves. In front of him rested a battered lunchbox, the kind made of steel, with a handle worn smooth by time. He opened it with deliberate care, revealing a sandwich and an old photo tucked beneath it, creased and faded, yet unmistakably him. As he unfolded the paper, a small photo slipped out from beneath it, creased at the corners, colors faded. 5 figures stood shoulder to shoulder, faces obscured by desert dust and dark sunglasses. One of them unmistakably younger, but unmistakably him. A chopper loomed in the background, rotors frozen mid-motion, the tail number blurred just enough to mean something, or everything. He slid the photo back inside, slowly, as if touching it too long might disturb something sacred. Across the yard, 2 young soldiers laughed as they shared energy drinks and scrolled their phones. One of them pointed briefly in Elijah's direction. He didn't react. Years had taught him when not to rise, when silence said more than words ever could. Some men wore their rank on collars, others carried it in the weight behind their stillness. Elijah remained at his post, logging plate numbers with the same quiet diligence. He moved slowly but precisely, pen gliding across the clipboard like muscle memory. His vest, issued, sun-faded, stitched once at the seam, bore no name, no rank, just security in block letters. From the motor pool, 2 lieutenants strolled toward the entrance, laughing over something on one of their phones. Fresh faces, early 20s, clean-shaven, full of a kind of confidence that hadn't yet been tempered. As they neared Elijah, the taller one nudged his companion, smirking. "Bet he tells people he served in Nam or something," he muttered. The other snorted. "Man, if that jacket could talk, it'd beg for retirement." Elijah said nothing. He nodded slightly as they passed. His grip on the pen tightened just a hair. They kept going. "My uncle was Special Forces," the second one added louder now, glancing back at Elijah. "Real deal Green Beret. Didn't end up working a gate in his 60s. Elijah continued checking IDs. The next driver, an older woman in medical scrubs, noticed the tension and offered him a sympathetic smile. He returned it, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind him, the lieutenants were still lingering, now watching as he moved toward the rear lot to make note of a broken barrier arm. "You think he really served?" one of them said. "Or just playing soldier to feel important?" "No clue," the other replied. "But whatever it was, clearly didn't end well. Probably got kicked out, and they let him hang around out of pity." They laughed again. What they didn't see was the way Elijah's hand trembled ever so slightly as he scribbled in his log, or how his jaw tightened, then loosened, before he exhaled slow, steady. He wasn't new to doubt, wasn't fragile, but sometimes even stone gets worn down when it's hit in the same place too many times. He adjusted the cap on his head, the brim shadowing his eyes. That cap, like the jacket, bore no unit insignia, but under the brim, his eyes had seen more than either young man could imagine. And he wasn't here to convince them of anything. Later that afternoon, the break room behind the admin wing buzzed with low conversation and the hum of an old vending machine. It was the kind of off-hour lull where words filled the quiet more than the coffee did. At one table, 4 junior personnel sat with plastic trays, pushing food around as they talked in half-joking, half-curious tones. "You think that guy really did anything?" one of them asked, nodding toward the direction of the gate. "The old man with the clipboard." "He walks like he's still in formation," another said, grinning. "But I've never seen a single ribbon on that jacket, not even a nameplate." "He probably just likes playing soldier," someone offered. "Keeps the fantasy alive." A young sergeant, older than the others, late 30s maybe, looked up from his tray. He'd been quiet until now, but something about the conversation pulled him in. "That man's name is Elijah Brooks," he said plainly, "and there's a reason some folks don't wear their history on their sleeves." The group fell silent for a moment, unsure whether to laugh, nod, or change the subject. "Look," the second airman said, shrugging. "If he's legit, why hasn't anyone ever mentioned it? I mean, nobody just forgets to file a DD-214. You think he's some kind of Black Ops ghost?" The sergeant didn't answer right away. He finished a bite of his sandwich and set the fork down with care. "Sometimes," he said, "the ones who did the hardest things are the ones who were never supposed to exist in the first place. And if that was your job, to be invisible, you don't stop just because you retired." One of the lieutenants from earlier had wandered in and overheard the last part. He chuckled under his breath, louder than necessary. Or maybe he just tells himself that to feel better about where he ended up. The sergeant turned to him, eyes steady. Or maybe some people ended up where they are because it was the only place that let them live with what they survived. That landed heavier than expected. No one spoke for a few beats. Then the microwave beeped in the corner, and the spell broke. Trays were picked up. Conversation shifted. But the question lingered in the room long after the coffee cooled. What if you were wrong about someone? Not just once, but every day. The next morning unfolded like any other. The sun crept up slow behind the tree line, casting long golden stripes across the pavement. At Fort Arden's south gate, Elijah was already posted, jacket zipped halfway, clipboard in hand, cap pulled low. He moved with quiet precision, greeting drivers with a nod, checking passes without fuss. Just past 0700, the usual rhythm was interrupted by a convoy of black SUVs approaching from the base road. The lead vehicle bore government plates, the kind that whispered importance without saying a word. As it neared the checkpoint, Elijah instinctively stepped forward to perform his duty. The SUV slowed, blinkers flashing. But instead of just rolling through, the front passenger door opened. Out stepped a tall man in dress blues, impeccably pressed uniform, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, shoes polished to mirror shine. General Harold McMillan. His name echoed across command channels like a drumbeat. Decorated, demanding, exact. Elijah looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. But he didn't move, The general paused for a half breath. His eyes scanned Elijah's face, then dropped lower to the jacket. His gaze locked onto the faint outline of a patch on the left breast, long faded, barely visible. Just stitching now. He froze. The aides behind him, still half in the SUV, looked puzzled. One of them stepped forward. "Sir?" But Macmillan didn't respond. Instead, with movements crisp and unmistakable, he brought his heels together, raised his right hand, and delivered a formal military salute. Sharp, deliberate, unwavering. The checkpoint fell silent. A passing jogger slowed to a stop. Two nearby staff sergeants halted mid-conversation. Even the SUV engine seemed to quiet as the general held the salute. Elijah didn't react right away. He stood still, clipboard still pressed lightly to his side. But after a long, suspended moment, his hand rose slowly, matching the salute with quiet certainty. It wasn't theatrical. It was muscle memory, measured, respectful, earned. "Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks," the general said, voice even but audible to those within earshot. "Echo Detachment, Mali, 1999. Am I correct?" Elijah's reply came low and steady. "Yes, sir." The general lowered his salute. "Your team pulled us out of that canyon when every exit had collapsed. I never saw your face, but I remember that call sign." "And that patch?" Elijah nodded once. "Didn't expect to be recognized. We were told none of it happened." The general stepped closer. "Orders like that made sense back then, but some debts don't expire with the mission." Around them, the onlookers stared in disbelief. Those who had mocked Elijah just a day earlier stood frozen, some embarrassed, some confused. The general turned to them briefly. "If any of you have doubts about the man standing this post, understand this. He carried more weight in one night than most of us will in an entire tour." Then to Elijah, with quiet gravity, "You saved lives, including mine. I won't forget again." Elijah didn't smile. He simply lowered his hand and stepped aside, clearing the path. The general walked past, not as a superior, but as a man paying a long overdue debt. The two men sat in a quiet corner of the base cafe, tucked just inside the commissary. It wasn't built for high-ranking visitors, just scratched tables, plastic chairs, and a coffee machine that sputtered more than it poured. But none of that seemed to matter. General Harold Macmillan, still in full dress uniform, leaned forward with his elbows on the table, a paper cup of black coffee steaming between his hands. Across from him, Elijah Brooks sat without pretense, posture straight but unassuming, the old jacket zipped halfway as always. For a moment, neither spoke. The general stared at Elijah, his brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in reflection, as if trying to reconcile the past with what stood before him now. "I tried to find you," Macmillan said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of command. "After we got back, the operation was redacted before we hit the tarmac. Every file sealed. I asked questions and hit brick walls. They told me it was for national security." He paused. "I believed them." Elijah didn't flinch. "That was the job. No names. No medals, no stories." The general nodded slowly. "I remember the voice on the comms that night. Calm as stone, even when things went to hell. You called out the canyon route. Gave us 3 minutes to move. We lost 2 birds before we even lifted, but 32 of us got out. Because of you." Elijah sipped his coffee. It wasn't humility on his face, it was something deeper, a kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. "We lost 4 getting you there, and the 5th made it home, but not for long. Cancer took him in 2007. Another took his own life the year after." The general looked away, his jaw tightening. "And the army never even said thank you." They couldn't, Elijah said. Not bitter, not angry. Just matter of fact. Not when the mission didn't happen. Macmillan set his cup down with quiet finality. Well, it happened. I was there, and I'm still here because of you. So let's fix what we can. The general slid a folder across. Not official, but enough to reopen your case. This is what I could scrape together without tripping more alarms than necessary. I've already called in a request to unseal your injury records. It won't get the mission declassified, but it'll be enough for the VA to reopen your case. Elijah took the folder slowly, fingers brushing over the edge like he wasn't sure it was real. Been denied 3 times. Last guy at the counter said I might have been confused with someone else. That ends now, Macmillan said. You served, you bled, you sacrificed. The fact that we can't talk about the mission doesn't mean it didn't change history, or your body. Elijah closed the folder gently. I'm not trying to rewrite anything, General. I just want my leg fixed so I can sleep through the night without it locking up. You'll get more than that, the General said firmly. You'll get respect, from the system and from the people who need to know what it costs to do what you did. He leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah again, not as a subordinate, not even as a war hero, but as an equal. You shouldn't still be standing guard at a gate, Elijah. You should be teaching in a war college. Elijah chuckled softly, almost to himself. I've always been better at quiet exits than loud lessons. Well, the General said, lifting his cup. Maybe it's time to change that too. 3 weeks later, the rust-colored file that had sat dormant in a restricted archive for over 2 decades surfaced quietly onto the VA's secure system. No press release, no memo. Just a line of data blinking green where it had once been red. Inside it were fragments, coded mission reports, injury logs with redacted locations, treatment orders signed by medics whose names had long since disappeared from active rosters. And one name, Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, no longer listed as non-verifiable. The first sign Elijah received wasn't a phone call or an official letter. It was a notification at the gate. A young sergeant handed him a sealed envelope marked Personnel Action. He opened it with the caution of a man used to rejection. But inside was a directive. His case had been reinstated. A secondary note in the corner, typed in small caps, read, Per direct order, General H. Macmillan. The next week, he stood at the base clinic, arms crossed, waiting for a doctor who, this time, knew his name before asking for it. By the end of the month, Elijah had completed his first full session of physical therapy in over 15 years. The work was slow, painful, but it was progress. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was simply managing damage. He was repairing it. On a cool Friday morning, he walked through the commissary, not in uniform, but in a pressed jacket that had been cleaned, its faded patch replaced, not by something shiny, but by the exact insignia once erased. Beneath it, a new pin caught the light. The Presidential Unit Citation, issued retroactively to his team. Veterans who had once passed him by now gave small nods. A few even stopped him, hands outstretched, quiet words of gratitude exchanged in the soft spaces between the shelves. He didn't seek attention. He still walked with the same steady rhythm. But the weight had shifted. The silence was no longer forced. It was chosen. And when the young woman at customer service greeted him with a warm, "Good morning, Sergeant Brooks," he smiled gently and replied, "Morning, Alicia." Because now she knew. And that made all the difference. Elijah was finishing up his afternoon route, clipboard in hand, when he noticed the same 2 lieutenants approaching from across the lot. Their demeanor was different this time. No laughter, no side comments. Just a measured walk and a visible tension in their posture. One of them, the taller of the two, held his cap in both hands. The other glanced at Elijah, then quickly looked down like a cadet being called into a commander's office. They stopped a few feet away from him and stood at attention. "Staff Sergeant Brooks," the taller one began, voice steady but subdued. "We'd like to speak with you, if that's all right." Elijah paused, studied them for a moment. He gave a small nod. The lieutenant cleared his throat. "Sir, Sergeant, we owe you an apology. For our comments last week, for the assumptions, for everything." His voice cracked slightly, not from nerves, but from something closer to shame. "We spoke without knowledge, without respect," the other added quickly. "And we judged you based on what we saw, not what we understood." Elijah didn't answer right away. He let the moment hang long enough to feel real. Then he said quietly, "Most people don't look past the uniform, or the lack of one." The taller lieutenant nodded. "We realize that now." "I was trained to work in silence," Elijah continued, eyes still steady on them. "It's easy for people to forget ghosts, even easier when those ghosts keep their heads down and their mouths shut." The shorter officer looked pained. "That's not an excuse for what we said." "No," Elijah agreed. "But understanding's a start." There was a pause. "I heard your story's part of the training curriculum now," the taller one offered, voice quieter. "General McMillan, he made sure of it. Said your unit's lessons belong to all of us." Elijah raised an eyebrow just slightly. "They teach you how to recognize a man who's carried something longer than his boots held up?" The younger man straightened his back. "They teach us to shut up and listen." Elijah let a small smile touch the corner of his mouth. "Then maybe we're getting somewhere." The two lieutenants stood a moment longer, then nodded respectfully and turned to leave. As they walked away, one looked back. Just once. This time he didn't laugh. A week later, Elijah stood at the front of a low-lit briefing room in the training wing of Fort Arden. The folding chairs were filled with young officers, some barely out of ROTC, others fresh from their first deployment. The air smelled faintly of dry erase markers and military-grade coffee. At the back of the room, a digital slide glowed with the title, "Extraction Under Denial, Lessons from Echo Detachment." No rank on his shoulders, no medals on his chest, just that same old jacket, cleaned, pressed, and worn with purpose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He spoke slowly, plainly, letting the silence between words do as much work as the words themselves. "We didn't call ourselves heroes. Didn't have time for that. Most of the time we weren't even sure we'd make it out." He paused. "But we planned anyway. We adapted. We carried each other." The room was still. Even the note-taking had stopped. "A lot of folks think danger looks like gunfire. Truth is, it often looks like a decision made 2 hours before contact, or a call you make that nobody hears about, because it worked." He let that land. From the second row, one young officer, Lieutenant Mercer, raised a hand. "Sir, why share this now?" Elijah looked her in the eye. "Because someone once told me silence was part of the job." And it was. But wisdom that stays buried doesn't do much good. You're the next ones walking in the dark. Figure it's time someone left a light on. Soldiers jogged past in formation, boots striking pavement in perfect rhythm. A few nodded in his direction, not out of obligation, but recognition. At the far edge of the parking lot, a group of young recruits stood near a vending machine, laughing and talking over one another. As Elijah walked by, their voices dipped, and one of them, barely 20, stood a little straighter and offered a quiet, respectful, "Good afternoon, Sergeant." Elijah returned the nod, his gaze steady, his pace unchanged. As he approached his truck, a familiar voice called out behind him, "Sergeant Brooks." He turned to see General McMillan walking across the lot, flanked by a junior officer struggling to keep up with his stride. "We've finalized the ceremony for Specialist Durham's daughter," the general said, tone softer than usual. "We'd be honored if you'd stand with the family when they present the Silver Star." Elijah nodded once. "Wouldn't be right any other way." The general hesitated, then added, "We're also moving forward with that training program we talked about." "Your input's requested." Elijah chuckled low. "Didn't figure I'd be drafted again at my age." Macmillan smiled. "Just a different kind of service." As the general walked off, Elijah stood a moment, looking out across the base. The gates, the drills, the rising flags. He'd never needed applause, but now, at last, the silence around him felt full instead of hollow. And for the first time in years, he let himself breathe. All the way in,